Hey guys, so I have something a bit different today. There are a lot of subjects that I'm interested in learning about. Some of them are subjects I've only just recently started to get into. Some of them I've had at the back of my mind for a long time. I like to think I'm someone who has a very wide range of interests in terms of what nonfiction subjects I like to learn about. And thinking back to what I talk about on my channel, I like to think that does come through. That I have a pretty wide-ranging interest in many different subjects, and that's awesome because learning is fun. But it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes because I don't always know exactly where to start. Or what books on a subject are good or informative or are biased, perhaps, or are just digestible. Some nonfiction subjects require a sort of easing in. It's hard for me to jump right into a 1,000-page book on a subject that I've only just started to develop an interest in. So sometimes there are just books that perhaps aren't great for beginners in a subject. So what I want to talk about is a lot of those nonfiction subjects that I have an interest in right now. Some of them are older than others, but they're all things I want to learn about. And the common denominator for all of them is that I don't really know where to start, or I don't really know of anything, really. I don't know of any books on the subject, and it would be, in order for me to find a good book that might be something I would enjoy, and, again, not be overwhelmed by, might be difficult just given my lack of knowledge on some of these subjects. Some of them are subjects where I literally know very, very, almost nothing. And so sometimes my starting knowledge is so basic that, like, the book I would need to start would be pretty broad. So anyway, what I want from you all is I would love recommendations on all of these subjects, from any that you've read, and not just books. Books, of course, this is BookTube, that is the primary medium, but documentaries or articles or anything, basically any sort of learning resource that you might recommend on any of these subjects. I would love to hear. So yeah, basically that's all. And in your recommendations, feel free to go to town. If you've read 15 books on a subject, don't be afraid to just leave me several recommendations. Or if you've only read one book that you've really loved and you think I would like, then again, the one book I want the recommendation anyway. Just basically anything that you've read or seen on the subject, I'm interested to hear that you think would be good for getting started in the area and getting informed on these subjects. So I'll go through them. I'll try to be relatively brief because there are quite a few of these subjects. So the first one is Chile, the country of Chile in South America. History, culture, languages, writers from that country. So this is one of the few cases where I would be open to fiction as well, and poetry. Writers from Chile, who wrote fiction or nonfiction, again, or poetry or prose. Just basically anything about Chile. Any books about Chile or by Chilean authors, I would be very interested. Chilean authors who aren't Pablo Neruda. I do know that Pablo Neruda is Chilean, and I do want to read him eventually, but anyway, and the second one is Colombia. Again, history, culture, languages, writers from that country whose name isn't Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And the same goes for the next one, which is Central Asia, which is sort of a much more vague, broad term, but the way I'm basically defining it is the countries that are south of Russia but north of India. So the most of them end in stan. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and then there's also the western portions of China that sort of veer into Central Asia, where the Uyghur Muslim minority in China live. The province of Xinjiang, I believe it's called. So that area of the world, I really, again, history, culture, writers, languages, etc. That's an area of the world that I know little about. I probably know a bit more than I know about Chile or Colombia, but still, most of what I've learned about it is just in relation to, like, Alexander the Great, since he did a lot of traveling around that area in his conquests. So yeah, And next, moving more into science, cosmology. Physics is an area I'm sort of interested in. I'm not interested in very, very technical stuff regarding physics and cosmology, but I've always been fascinated by the vastness of the universe, essentially. And so, yeah, if you have any books to recommend on that subject. And then the next one, sort of relatedly, is the subject of big history, which Crash Course, the channel Crash Course, did a sort of mini-series on of 10 episodes. And I watched those 10 episodes like 20 times because I thought that they were just fascinating. But big history sort of takes a very sort of macroscopic view of history. So we usually think of history as sort of about specific areas or specific people or specific phenomena, but big history takes a very macroscopic approach, and it starts with the Big Bang and goes through the development of the universe as we know it, and into the beginning of life on Earth and the evolution of humans, and so on into the Industrial Revolution and the technological revolution that I suppose we're still in the midst of, and stuff like that. So books on big history, if any of you know of them. And the next three are all kind of all sort of on the same note. The Rwandan genocide, ethnic cleansing in the Bosnian War, and the Armenian genocide. And I might also add in the Holocaust. I've just lately been getting interested in learning about the monstrous things that humans do, and trying to make some sense of them or understand them in some way. So any of these 4 subjects, I would be interested in hearing your recommendations on. Next, a bit more cheerfully, is music. With a specific focus on Western classical music, and Western classical music defined broadly. So within this conception of Western classical music that I'm using, I would include both, Bach and Pyotr Tchaikovsky and Arnold Schoenberg. Even though, Bach was in the Baroque era, and then you have someone like Mozart who was in the real classical era, and then someone like Tchaikovsky is more of a romantic composer, and then Schoenberg is a modernist. But in my mind, I sort of lump them all under the broad and vague and unscientific term of Western classical music, just because it makes it easier to think about. So I'm interested in biographies of composers, and I'm going to list some composers that I'm particularly interested in. So biographies of composers, discussions of the specific composer's work, perhaps, their actual music. Yeah, and also perhaps, if anyone knows of, guides to music, guides to classical music of some sort. I know that there are books out there that are sort of almost encyclopedias, where there will be an entry for all sorts of different pieces of classical music from throughout history, and it'll have, some of the history of its composition, some discussion of the major, themes of the piece of music, and, just it's the music itself. And stuff like that. So if anyone knows of some sort of broad, sort of encyclopedic guide to classical music, that would be great as well. But anyway, I'll list some composers that I'm particularly interested in. So Mozart, of course, Beethoven, naturally, Tchaikovsky, Schoenberg, and Dmitri Shostakovich as well. And I think I would also say J.S. Bach as well. So yeah, any books on those composers and their work. Next is collections of book reviews, but specifically book reviews of non-fiction books. That's more what I'm interested in as just sort of general reading. I find that it's much easier to get into reviews of non-fiction books if I haven't read the non-fiction book than it is with fiction. With fiction, when I read a book review of a novel that I haven't read, I don't really have any sort of framework for thinking about the novel because I don't know anything about it. But with non-fiction book reviews, the author usually brings you up to speed and tells you what subject they're talking about, and you have the opportunity to learn about that subject just from reading the review. And sometimes the review can be informative but not overwhelming, I guess. Reading a book review of a nonfiction book on a subject can be a palatable way to start getting into a subject. And then you can go read the book that the author just reviewed to get more into the subject if you want to, but you also don't have to commit to that book if it's, a 1,000-page biography of Stalin or something. So yeah, anyway, collections of nonfiction book reviews. Next is writers' diaries and journals and notebooks. I have a few writers whose journals and notebooks I want to read. Susan Sontag is one in particular who's been on my mind, but also Sylvia Plath, of course, famously. Virginia Woolf, I believe some of her diary has been published. But beyond those, I really don't know of very many. And also, I should say, I actually don't want just the journals and diaries of writers. Also, just, I think artists in general. If you know of the diaries of great painters or great composers or dancers, perhaps, that would be really cool too. So yeah, and the next two are sort of a pair. The first is the history of the Soviet Union with a focus on Stalinist Russia, and so biographies of Stalin would be welcome, but I'm also interested in learning about the prison camp system, and also just, I guess, the sort of nature of this totalitarian regime, I suppose, as general overviews of what it was like to live in the Soviet Union. And same thing with the next one, which is communist Czechoslovakia, which I'm interested in learning about because my dad grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, but he doesn't talk about it very often, so I don't really know much about it. So yeah, again, just histories of communist Czechoslovakia, what it was like to live in communist Czechoslovakia, perhaps biographies of important people. I'm not as familiar with the specific people involved with communist Czechoslovakia. But yeah, and then the next one is the Palestine-Israel conflict, that is obviously ongoing. But yeah, books on that subject. It's an issue I feel very strongly about, but also don't feel as well informed on it as I should. So books on that subject. And then lastly, a bit more cheery is histories of the Midwest, with a focus on Iowa because that is where I live. Yeah, anything you might know about the history of the Midwest or books about the history of the Midwest, just let me know. And yeah, that is what I have. Those are the subjects I'm most interested in learning about that I don't really know where to start. There are obviously other subjects that I am interested in, but with a lot of the other subjects, I already own books or know of books, or I have sort of a set of books that I know I will read at some point on the subject. And it's not that I don't value your guys' recommendations on those subjects. It's just that I don't want to add more recommendations to what is sometimes already a big pile of books that I have yet to make a very big dent in. So, yeah, any recommendations, please. I would love to hear. And thank you ahead of time for your recommendations, guys. And, yeah, anyway, I hope you're having a nice weekend, and I will talk to you all in my next video. So, anyway, bye, guys.